The chamber was already loud when I walked in, but it went quiet the moment I stepped up to the podium. 847 delegates, seated in their tiered rows, stared at me with the particular kind of stillness that comes just before something breaks. I had been in this room many times before. I had stood at this same podium, under these same pale lights, and spoken carefully chosen words that were designed to keep doors open and tempers low. I was good at it. That was why Earth had sent me here in the first place. My name is Catherine Elliott. I had been Earth's senior ambassador to the Galactic Assembly for 11 years. In that time, I had negotiated 4 trade agreements, settled 2 border disputes, and kept humanity from being formally censured on 9 separate occasions. I was, by any honest measure, the most experienced human diplomat alive. I had sat in this chamber during votes that went against us, and found polite language to express disappointment. I had shaken hands with species that considered us a minor footnote in galactic history, and managed to make those handshakes feel like equals meeting. I had written letters, filed petitions, submitted impact assessments, requested hearings, arranged consultations, and pursued every formal and informal route the Assembly's framework offered. I was also, as of 3 hours ago, the last one any of them would ever deal with. The vote had been taken at dawn, Assembly time. I had sat in the glass-walled observation gallery on the upper tier and watched the tally board climb in real time. The resolution was simple on its face. It said that humanity had acted outside the bounds of galactic law by establishing permanent settlements on 6 moons in the Kepler corridor without Assembly authorization. It called for an immediate trade embargo, a freeze on all human-registered vessels in Assembly-controlled space, and a complete communications blackout on any outgoing signal from Earth or its territories until such time as humanity submitted a formal compliance petition. The language was precise, and the intent behind it was not subtle. Comply or suffer. Come back to the table or watch your economy contract. That was the message, dressed in procedural clothing, and every delegate in the room knew it. The final count was 847 in favor, 1 against. I had cast the single vote against. Now I stood at the podium with a single sheet of paper in my hand, and I looked out at the faces of every species that had just decided humanity's future, without asking humanity a single question. I saw the Zelthari delegates in their silver-trimmed robes, sitting very straight, already composing their self-congratulatory statements in their minds. I saw the Yethri cluster in the lower tier, their bioluminescent skin flickering with what passed for satisfaction among their kind. I saw the Miron block in the far left section, looking merely bored, as though the whole proceeding had been inevitable and therefore not worth much energy. And I saw Velkareth, the Zelthari senior ambassador, in his seat at the center of the first ring, watching me with the patient calm of someone who expected to hear an apology. I have thought about that look many times since, the patience of it, the certainty. He was not angry. He did not need to be angry. He had 847 votes. He had the full institutional weight of a body that had governed galactic affairs for 3,000 years. He was watching a junior diplomat from a minor species stand at a podium, about to do what every species in that situation had eventually done, which was acknowledge the situation and submit. I did not give him that. I looked down at the paper in my hand. It had come through on a secured channel 2 hours earlier, signed by the full Earth Senate, and countersigned by every branch of the planetary government. It was not a draft. It was not a proposal offered for discussion or amendment. It was a resolution, already passed by an absolute majority, already codified into law, irreversible by any mechanism the Assembly could invoke, because the Assembly had no authority over Earth's internal governance, and never had. I read it aloud without preamble, in a flat, clear voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. The Earth Senate, acting under the full authority of its charter, hereby announces the formal and permanent withdrawal of the United Earth Government from all diplomatic, economic, and communicative agreements with the Galactic Assembly and its member states, effective upon the conclusion of this address. All Assembly-affiliated treaties are considered dissolved. All outstanding accords are terminated. All channels of diplomatic communication are closed as of this moment. This decision is not subject to appeal, renegotiation, or reversal through any Assembly process, as the United Earth Government no longer recognizes the Assembly as a body with legitimate authority over human affairs or the affairs of any human-administered territory. This statement constitutes our final official address to this body. I placed the paper on the podium, flat, centered. I unpinned the small silver translator device from the collar of my jacket and set it beside the paper. Without it, anything I said would come out in plain English, rendered into none of the 46 assembly languages that the device normally handled in real time. But I had nothing left to say, not in any language. I turned and walked toward the exit doors. The chamber did not erupt immediately. There was a gap, perhaps 2 seconds, where 847 minds all encountered the same wall at the same moment and could not process what they were seeing. Catherine Elliott, Earth's senior ambassador, a woman who had sat in this room for 11 years and never once broken protocol, was walking away from the podium without permission, without a formal close, without bowing to the presiding chair. Then the room came apart. Not with anger, not at first. It was confusion. The pure, cascading sound of 847 minds encountering something they had no category for. I heard the rapid clicking of Zelthari's speech, a sound like small stones being dropped on glass, rising fast. I heard the low harmonic pulses of the Yethri communication layer vibrating in my chest, even at this distance. I heard the assembly's chief moderator calling for order in 3 languages simultaneously. I heard someone shouting. I heard someone else transmitting something urgent on a side frequency that my translator, still sitting on the podium, could no longer render for me. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I did not look back. The corridor outside the chamber was empty. My footsteps were the only sound in it. The lights in the assembly's outer halls were the standard pale gold the station used everywhere, designed to approximate comfortable light for the broadest range of species. I had always found them slightly too dim. I walked through them without thinking about it, the way you walk through a space that you know, with absolute certainty, you are never going to enter again. My aide, a young man named Oliver Grant, was waiting at the corridor's junction point, exactly where I had told him to be. He was 26 years old, and had been with me for 2 years, and he had the look of someone who had spent the last hour preparing himself for a range of possible outcomes, and had managed to arrive at none of them. He was holding my bag. His face was very still. "Ambassador," he said, and stopped. "We're going to the ship," I said. "Yes," he said. He fell into step beside me without another word. That was one of the things I valued about Oliver. He understood the difference between a moment that needed talking through and a moment that needed covering ground. We did not speak again until we were through the outer doors of the station's upper wing, walking across the external landing platform under the station's artificial night sky, which was a deep and convincing black interrupted only by the distant lights of docked vessels and the faint shimmer of the energy screens that kept the atmosphere contained. The air on the platform was the same recycled mix the station used everywhere, slightly too clean, faintly flat, like water that has been filtered of everything including the things you did not know you were tasting. I breathed it in because I had never particularly objected to it, and because old habits do not break cleanly, even when everything else is breaking. The shuttle was waiting at the far dock. The pilot, a woman named Dana Prell, had the engines already cycling when we arrived. She had been monitoring the assembly feed on her secondary screen. She looked at me once when we boarded, assessed something in my face with the rapid efficiency of someone who has flown diplomatic personnel through complicated situations before, and turned back to her controls. She did not ask anything. She began pre-flight without being told. We lifted off 2 minutes later. The Galactic Assembly's home station was a vast structure, built over 4 centuries by the combined labor of 39 species. And from the outside, from the correct angle and in the right kind of darkness, it looked genuinely beautiful. It glittered like an entire city turned sideways in the void, layer upon layer of light and structure reflecting off the station's outer shell, the kind of thing that, 11 years ago when I had first arrived, had stopped me at the viewport of my incoming transport and made me hold my breath. I watched it shrink through the shuttle window now as Dana pulled us into the departure lane. I noted that it still looked beautiful. I noted also that I felt nothing in particular about that. The Unscore Meridian was a mid-class cruiser, assigned to diplomatic transport and support work. It was fast and well-equipped, and staffed by people who had been selected in part for their ability to look calm when situations were not calm. Captain Leon Adler met me at the docking bay, shook my hand without ceremony, and walked with me toward the bridge without making me account for anything I was not ready to account for. When we reached the bridge, the comms officer, a quiet and precise man named Peter Voss, turned from his station and said, "Ambassador, we are receiving contact requests on 42 separate frequencies, assembly channels, member state direct lines, 3 from the Zelthari diplomatic office specifically." I took the observer's seat. The bridge was warm and brightly lit, both things that the assembly's halls never quite managed. Outside the viewport, the stars were fixed and clear and indifferent. "Log all of them," I said. "Do not answer any of them." Peter turned back to his board. Captain Adler stood beside my chair. He said nothing for a long moment, looking out at the stars with the particular quality of attention that experienced ship captains have, as though the void outside is something worth watching closely. Then, quietly, he said, "Earth Command wants a status report. They want to know if it went as you expected." "Tell them yes," I said. He looked at me sideways, not with doubt, with something more careful. "Did it?" he asked. I thought about the vote tally climbing, Velkareth's patient face, the sound the room made when I placed the translator on the podium and turned my back. "They were going to keep doing it," I said. "Every year, another sanction, another resolution, another vote, where 847 delegates decide what we're allowed to build, and where we're allowed to go, and how fast we're allowed to grow." 11 years I was in that room. 11 years of patience and process, and formally worded objections. They never once asked us what we needed. They never once treated the answer as something they were obligated to consider. Adler was quiet. "So we stopped," I said. "We stopped explaining ourselves, and we stopped asking, and we stopped pretending the process was something other than what it was. And now we find out what happens next." The comms board chimed softly. Peter said, "51 contact requests now, Ambassador." "I heard," I said. I looked out at the stars and let them hold still the way they always do. The same stars I had looked at for 11 years, from ships and stations and embassy windows scattered across the Assembly's territory. They had not changed. The Assembly had not changed. Humanity, though. Humanity had been changing very quietly, for a long time, building in the spaces between the notices and the censures and the resolutions, constructing things and learning things and growing in directions that the Assembly had never thought to monitor, because it had never imagined they mattered. That was going to become a significant problem for 847 delegates very soon. "Admiral Okafor is on the secure line from Earth Command," Peter said. "Put him through," I said. The Admiral's voice was deep and unhurried. "Catherine, the Assembly is already preparing a formal statement calling your address a violation of Galactic conduct standards." "I expected that," I said. "They want a retraction. They won't get one." A pause on the line. I could hear the slight sound of a working bridge in the background, the low hum and soft tones of a ship that was awake and operational. "Did any of them follow you out?" he asked. That was the question. That had always been the question, from the moment the Senate resolution had landed in my secured inbox 2 hours before the vote. Whether the statement would land in an empty corridor, or whether it would shake something loose. "Not yet," I said, "but give it time. When the quiet settles in and the numbers start coming through, they'll come looking." Another pause, longer. "Then let them look," he said. "Yes, sir," I said. "That is exactly what we're going to do." The stars held still. The comms board kept accumulating requests, each one a voice trying to reach across a distance that was no longer just physical. I sat in the warm light of the Meridian's bridge and did not answer a single one of them, and the silence that I sent back across 51 open frequencies was not empty. It was full of everything the Assembly had not listened to for 11 years, returned now without explanation, without apology, without the slightest concession to the idea that it owed anyone in that glittering station a single additional word. Dana Prell set our course for deep space. The engines hummed at a register I had always found comfortable. Oliver brought me coffee from the galley and set it on the arm of my chair without being asked. I sat with it for a while before I drank it. I was thinking about the 11 years, not cataloging them, not reviewing them in any formal sense, just letting the full shape of them exist in my mind for a moment, without trying to organize or justify anything about them. The early years when I had arrived believing, as most diplomats in my position arrived believing, that the system was basically functional and just required skilled navigation. The middle years, when I had understood that the system was not basically functional and that skilled navigation was being used to manage its dysfunction rather than to correct it. The later years when I had watched the Senate resolution take shape in closed sessions and had felt, for the first time, not the loss of hope, but the end of a particular kind of patience that had been, for a long time, indistinguishable from hope. You do not walk away from 11 years of work without sitting with what they were. I had done good things in that time. I had kept the trade agreement alive that supplied 3 medical compound precursors to Earth's outer colonies. I had negotiated the border resolution that allowed free scientific transit through a corridor the Miran Collective had been blocking for 2 years. I had sat across from delegates who spoke to me with the barely concealed condescension of people who have decided that your species is a project rather than a partner, and I had found language that kept the conversation productive, because keeping the conversation productive had been the job. The job was done now. Oliver had been in the Assembly's halls since his 2nd year in the diplomatic service. He was not old enough to have the jaded quality that long diplomatic careers sometimes produced, but he was sharp enough to have understood, before many people his age would have, the gap between what the Assembly said it was and what it actually did. He had processed the Senate resolution with the steadiness of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time, and finally had the document to match the thought. The Yethri delegates were still in their seats when I came through the corridor, he said after a while. His voice was careful. He was giving me information, not offering an opinion. They were not going to walk out, I said. They have 4 colony worlds in active outbreak zones. They cannot afford to antagonize anyone right now. No, he said. We were both quiet. The Yethri situation was one of the calculations I had carried out of the chamber alongside the Senate resolution. It was not a comfortable calculation. People were sick on 4 worlds and the help they needed was in the hands of researchers who were not interested in assembly process, and the Assembly had just voted to cut off every formal route through which help might have been requested. I knew the situation would resolve itself, not through the Assembly, and not through any channel the Assembly controlled, but through the direct human capacity to solve problems, when institutional frameworks stepped back far enough to allow it. I believed that. I had seen the numbers. I trusted the calculation. I also knew it would take time, that sick people did not have in comfortable supply, and that the fact that the resolution was necessary did not make that cost disappear. There will be harder days than this one coming, I said. Yes, Oliver said. The silence is going to be difficult to maintain. There will be situations that seem to call for exceptions. Someone will send a message that is phrased exactly right, or there will be a crisis that makes the argument for reopening a channel seem reasonable. Oliver looked at me carefully. Is that a concern? No, I said. It is a description of what will happen. The concern would be if we were not prepared for it. I looked at the viewport, where the assembly station had now reduced to a faint cluster of lights against the dark. We will be prepared for it. Dana Prell announced a course adjustment. The engines shifted tone slightly, and then settled again. The lights in the station cluster behind us dimmed further as the distance increased. Within an hour, it would be indistinguishable from the other lights of the deep. I drank my coffee. I thought about the translator pin on the podium. I had bought it 11 years ago in a shop near the Earth Senate building on my last day before departing for the assembly station. It was the standard diplomatic model, small and silver, capable of rendering speech in real time across all 46 assembly languages at 93% contextual accuracy. I had worn it every day for 11 years. I had found, after some years, that I occasionally forgot it was there, the way you forget any object that has been part of your daily life long enough to become invisible. I had set it on the podium with care, not heavily, not as a gesture of anger. Just set it down flat, parallel to the paper, the way you set something down when you know you are not going to pick it up again, and you want the setting down itself to be correct. Some actions deserve to be done well, even when no one is watching closely, maybe especially then. The engines hummed. Oliver worked on his tablet. The stars held their positions outside the viewport. Somewhere behind us, 847 delegates were working through the shock of what had just happened, and beginning to construct their narratives about it, their explanations for why it had happened, and what it meant, and what the appropriate response was. Those narratives would all, in their various ways, miss the point, because the point was not something that could be located from inside the Assembly's framework for understanding events. The point was very simple. The point was that we had decided. Not in anger, not in desperation, not as a tactic or a negotiating position, or a temporary posture designed to produce a specific counter-move. We had decided, as a civilization, in the full knowledge of what it would cost, and what it would require, that we were done being managed, that the 11 years of patience had served their purpose, which was to demonstrate conclusively that patience alone was never going to produce a different result, that the correct response to a structure that treats your civilization as a problem to be administered was not to keep trying to make the structure comfortable with you, but to build somewhere the structure could not reach. We had been building there for a long time. The Assembly had not noticed because the Assembly had not looked. Dana Prell set our course for deep space. The engines hummed at a register I had always found comfortable. Oliver brought me coffee from the galley and set it on the arm of my chair without being asked. I drank it while the Assembly's home station fell behind us in the dark, becoming smaller and smaller until it was a single point of light among all the others, and then not even that. Ambassador Velkareth of the Zelthari Dominion had been a member of the Assembly for 22 years. He had negotiated the Greth Accords. He had brokered the peace between the Yethri and the Mirren Collective after the resource conflict of the 7th cycle, a negotiation that had lasted 19 months, and had at one point involved all 3 of his secondary staff requiring medical leave. He had served on the Assembly's Standards Committee, its Ethics Panel, and its Expansion Review Board. He had, by any honest accounting, done more to maintain the stability of galactic diplomatic relationships than nearly any other living diplomat. He was also, and this was central to his self-understanding, very good at knowing when a crisis was real and when it was theater designed to manufacture leverage. This, he told himself on the morning after Catherine Elliott walked out of the chamber, was theater. He poured himself a cup of the mineral extract he took each morning, and sat at his desk, and thought about it with the methodical calm that had served him well in 19 months of Mirran Yethri negotiations, and in every difficult situation before and since. The humans were angry. They had been building toward this for some time. The colonization of the 6 Kepler moons without Assembly authorization was a provocation, and the sanctions resolution was the Assembly's correct and measured response to it. The humans had chosen to respond to that correct and measured response with a dramatic gesture designed to create maximum public shock. They had timed it well. The walkout would generate a great deal of commentary for several cycles, and then, after the commentary settled, the humans would file their petition. Every species that had ever been sanctioned by the Assembly had filed a petition. It was not even a question of choice, really. It was the mechanics of the situation. Sanctions created economic pressure. Economic pressure created the conditions for negotiation. Negotiation produced a new framework. The new framework was always, in the end, better than the sanctions. That was why the process existed. It was self-correcting. The Assembly had used it 14 times over its long history, and it had worked 14 times. He fully expected a petition from Earth within the week. The first cycle passed without one. He spent it composing a preliminary framework for what a fair review of the human situation might look like, one that acknowledged the Kepler colonizations as a fait accompli, while establishing a compliance mechanism for future expansion. It was good work, balanced, practical, offering the humans a path back to full Assembly standing with dignity preserved. He was genuinely pleased with it. He filed it in a working folder and waited for the contact request that would allow him to present it. The second cycle passed without a contact request. He tried sending a direct line to the human embassy office, still technically registered on the station. The line connected, held for 2 seconds, and then played a brief recorded message in Assembly Standard that said the channel had been permanently closed and that no further communications from Assembly-affiliated parties would be accepted or stored. It did not offer an alternative channel. It did not suggest a future date for review. It simply ended. The line went quiet, and Velkareth sat for a moment, looking at the dark screen, and then asked his aide, a young Zelthari named Tessin, to log the attempt with the protocol office. On the 3rd cycle, one of the Yethri delegates stopped him in the hall between the chamber and the North Wing meeting rooms. Her name was Soraleth, and she was on the Assembly's Medical Liaison Committee. She asked if he had seen the early reports from the outer supply divisions. He said he had not. She said they were worth reading and moved on. He read them that evening. They were routine on the surface. Supply division reports always were. But in the fourth section, under a subheading that said simply, Contract Status Updates, he found the first thing that gave him a feeling he could not immediately name. It was a note, written in the dry administrative language that Supply Division always used, saying that service contracts held by a human firm called Reliant Signal Systems, covering maintenance of 43 of the Assembly's 81 long-range relay stations, had been terminated by the company before the sanctions vote, and had not been renewed. The note said that the Contracts Office had processed the termination filing and had assumed that transition arrangements were being handled by the Technical Division. The Technical Division had assumed the same thing about the Contracts Office. No transition arrangements existed. He called the infrastructure director, a Grethian named Vorsalith, who told him not to worry. The Assembly's own technical teams could absorb the relay maintenance. It would take some time, perhaps 20 cycles, to fully transfer the work, and there would be some signal degradation in the outer approaches in the meantime, but nothing critical. Some delays, some dropped signals. Inconvenient but manageable. He thanked Vorsalith, and ended the call. Then he sat at his desk for several minutes without moving, which was not something he normally did. He had a meeting in 40 minutes. He had 3 documents waiting for his review. He had a call scheduled with the Mirren trade representative at the 3rd hour. He ignored all of it and pulled up, for the first time, a complete list of all active commercial and service contracts between assembly institutions and human companies. He had never looked at this list before. It had never occurred to him that he needed to. The assembly was 3,000 years old. Its infrastructure and supply systems had evolved over the course of those 3,000 years, through countless negotiations and arrangements and agreements. And the practical management of all of it had long since settled into a division of labor between specialists, who handled their areas without needing to be overseen by senior diplomats. Things worked. That was the point of the systems. The list was very long. He read it with the growing, uncomfortable attention of someone who has walked into a room they thought they knew, and found that the floor plan has changed. There was the relay maintenance. There were distribution licenses through a company called Helix Biologic, supplying medical nanite compounds to 28 assembly worlds including 3 Zelthari colony systems. There were navigational data licenses from a firm called OpenChart, providing real-time hyperlane mapping updates to over 400 assembly-registered vessels. There was the cooling management contract for the Assembly's secondary power grid, held by a human engineering company for the past 14 years. There was the educational software agreement, covering 7 member state school systems. There was a logistics contract for cargo routing through 14 major transit hubs. There was a materials sourcing arrangement for the station's environmental systems. There was a data storage redundancy partnership for the Assembly's external archive network. There were 11 more items after those. None of them had been renewed. All of them had been terminated, properly and cleanly, with notices filed in the correct offices, in the appropriate filing format, over the course of the 2 weeks before the sanctions vote. Velkareth read through the list a second time, then a third. He was not prone to catastrophizing. He had trained himself out of that tendency over the course of a long diplomatic career where catastrophizing was the most reliable way to make bad situations worse. He read the list a third time and asked himself what the objective reality of each item was, stripped of the feeling the list as a whole produced. The relay network degradation would begin in approximately 8 cycles, and would become significant in 20. 43 of 81 stations losing maintenance meant the long-range communication network for the outer approaches would operate at reduced capacity within a month. Not dark, but impaired. The navigational data licenses had already expired, which meant 400 assembly vessels were currently running on charts that were 3 weeks out of date, and would become more out of date every day. The cooling management contract expiration would affect the Assembly's secondary power grid in ways that Vorsalith's division had not yet communicated to anyone, because they were apparently still discovering what the contract had actually covered. The medical nanite licenses were the item he returned to most. Helix Biologic had supplied treatment compounds to 28 worlds for the past 9 years. He called the Assembly's medical director, a thorough Yethri named Iru Salmon, and asked about stock levels. The answer was not as bad as his worst reading of the situation, but it was not good. Current stock would last, for the 3 Zelthari colony systems alone, approximately 60 cycles if usage remained constant. After that, there was no licensed source for the compounds. He asked about the Yethri plague vaccine separately, because Soraleth's comment in the hall had stayed with him. Iru-Saman's answer was the one that made him set the data slate down and look at the far wall of his office for a long moment. The Yethri plague vaccine formula was held exclusively by a human biotech company called Helix Biologic. The formula was proprietary, developed by 2 human researchers under a closed research agreement. The licensing arrangement between Helix Biologic and the Assembly's medical division had been terminated, along with every other Helix Biologic contract, in the 2 weeks before the vote. The formula had never been shared. It had never been required to be shared because the licensing arrangement had seemed stable. There were currently 4 Yethri colony worlds with active outbreak zones. Current vaccine supply, rationed, would last 30 cycles. After 30 cycles, without a new supply arrangement, people would die. He called his senior analyst, a thorough and precise woman named Greth Mail, and asked for a full impact assessment of all terminated contracts. He gave her 10 cycles. She returned in 4, which told him something about what she had found. She stood in his office and read from her report in the careful, controlled voice of someone who has located a significant problem and is presenting it as information rather than judgment. She said that of 46 terminated contracts identified, 11 covered services with no current assembly alternative. Of those 11, 3 involved supply chains requiring a minimum of 90 cycles to redirect. The relay network situation was as Vorsalith had described, but worse in the long term than Vorsalith had acknowledged. The navigational data situation was creating compounding errors that had already caused 2 transit delays in the outer corridor, and the Yethri plague vaccine situation was what she considered the most urgent item in the report. She finished. He thanked her. He waited until she had left before he let his face do anything other than listen calmly. He drafted an emergency contact request to the Human Embassy channel. He worded it carefully. He acknowledged the Assembly's position with appropriate neutrality. He expressed willingness to engage in a good faith review of the sanctions resolution in light of new information. He noted the medical situation as a matter of shared humanitarian concern, a framing he chose specifically because it was the framing least likely to be received as a capitulation. The reply arrived in 8 seconds. It was automated. The channel was permanently closed. No further communications from Assembly-affiliated parties would be accepted or monitored. The message ended with one line at the very bottom that he had not noticed the first time. This message was sent by an automated system and will not be reviewed. He put the slate down. He thought about the chamber, about 847 votes, and the certainty they had felt like. He thought about Catherine Elliott's footsteps going away down the corridor, and the sound the chamber made as they went. He had looked at her back and thought, she will come back. They always come back. There is no alternative structure. There is no other table. This is where galactic affairs are conducted, and they cannot conduct them outside this room. He had been wrong about that. He understood now, looking at Greth Mail's 4-page report, that he had been wrong about it in a very specific way. He had assumed that the Assembly was irreplaceable because it was old, and because nothing had ever replaced it. He had not asked whether it was irreplaceable because it was necessary, or because nothing had yet been motivated to build around it. He called Tessin and told him to begin drafting an emergency request, not to the Human Diplomatic Office, but to the administrative offices of the 6 Kepler corridor settlements directly. The settlements were outside the Assembly's recognized jurisdiction. The Assembly's own resolution had declared them illegal, which created the interesting contradiction of an Assembly body asking an illegal entity for medical assistance. Tessin's face was carefully neutral as he recorded the instruction. We would be implicitly recognizing the settlement's operational authority, he said. Yes, Velkareth said. The resolution from 12 cycles ago specifically denies their legal status. I know what the resolution says, Velkareth said. Draft the request. After Tessin left, Velkareth sat at his desk for a long time, in the pale gold light of his office. He thought about 22 years of skilled, patient, principled diplomatic work. He thought about the Greth Accords and the Mirren Yethri negotiations, and the 9 occasions on which he had helped prevent humanity from being formally censured. He thought about the moment he had cast his vote, with 746 others, and felt the clean satisfaction of a decision made clearly, and correctly. He thought about Catherine Elliott placing the translator pin on the podium with the particular care of someone who knows exactly what they are putting down and will not be picking it up again. Outside his window, the station's outer ring lights were slightly dimmer than they had been yesterday. The relay signal degradation had begun. Small, barely perceptible, but there. 847 to 1. He had been so certain about what that meant. He picked up Grethmail's report and began reading the section at the back that he had not yet reached, the one she had labeled Secondary Dependencies, which ran to 3 full pages. He had assumed the first section covered the important items. He read the secondary list and found, by the end of it, that his assumption had been wrong about that too. The secondary list was different in character from the primary items. The primary items were large contracts with clear titles and visible functions. The secondary list was made up of smaller things so embedded in the daily operation of the assembly's systems that they had never been assigned dedicated oversight because no one had imagined they needed it. A human company that provided routine updates to the assembly's legal translation database, keeping the 46-language corpus current with evolving usage. A human-operated calibration service for the assembly's 14 medical scanning arrays across the station's clinic network. A single human software engineer who had been on a rolling personal services contract for 6 years, maintaining a legacy code system in the assembly's financial reporting infrastructure that no one else had been trained on because the engineer had always simply handled it. The software engineer's contract had also expired. Velkareth set the report down and looked at his desk and thought about a word that he had heard human diplomats use occasionally in the assembly's halls. A word that other species generally translated as reckless or unprepared. The word was audacious. He had always translated it as reckless because that was the closest structural equivalent in Zelthari. Sitting with Grethmail's secondary list, he thought that perhaps reckless was not quite right. He thought that perhaps what audacious actually meant, in human usage, was something more like fully committed, the particular quality of action that comes from having decided completely and having not left a way back. The humans had not left a way back. They had terminated every contract, large and small. They had not done it in anger, in the way that anger produces large gestures and overlooks details. They had done it with the thoroughness of people who had looked at every connection they maintained with the assembly, and had decided, with complete deliberateness, to release each one. The relay maintenance and the vaccine formula were the items that would produce headlines. The legal translation database and the legacy financial code were the items that told you who these people actually were. He filed the report. He called the Yethri medical director again, and they discussed the vaccine situation for 20 minutes, and agreed on a set of contingency measures that bought them perhaps 5 additional cycles of supply stability. Not enough to matter in the long run, but enough to keep the situation from becoming immediately visible to the General Assembly membership. He thanked the director. He ended the call. He went to the window of his office and looked out at the station's outer ring, where the navigation lights blinked in their steady, familiar pattern. The same pattern he had watched from this window for 19 years. Everything looked the same. The station was the same station it had always been. The assembly was meeting tomorrow morning on the schedule it had always kept. The delegates would take their seats in the chamber where Catherine Elliott had placed a translator pin on a podium and walked away, and they would conduct their business in the way they always conducted it. And in the walls of that unchanged-looking station, 43 relay stations were going without maintenance. The navigational charts were 4 weeks out of date and counting. A financial system was running on code that its only maintenance engineer had been under no obligation to document before she left, and 4 Yethri colony worlds were measuring their supply in cycles. He stood at the window for a long time. He was not someone who had ever needed to stand at a window for a long time. He was an efficient man, a purposeful man, a man who moved from one well-considered action to the next without the kind of stillness that windows required. He stood there anyway. He thought about 3,000 years. He thought about the word audacious again, and this time he thought about it in the direction of the assembly, about whether an institution that had operated for 3,000 years without ever losing a sanctioned species had developed, through the long repetition of always being the largest thing in the room, something that looked like confidence but was actually closer to the absence of imagination. He thought about the 15 species that had been sanctioned before humanity, and had all filed their petitions on schedule, and had all returned to the fold in the expected pattern. And he thought about why he had assumed humanity would be the 16th instead of something else. He had assumed it because it was all that had ever happened before. He turned from the window and went back to his desk and picked up the preliminary framework document he had written so carefully on the second cycle, the one that offered a fair path forward with dignity preserved. He looked at it for a moment, and then he filed it in a folder he labeled Historical Review, and closed the folder and began, for the first time, drafting something different. Not a framework for a petition, not terms for a return. Something he had never drafted before, because the situation that called for it had never existed before. He was not certain what to call it yet, but it was going to have to start somewhere, and it was going to have to start from something other than the assumption that the Assembly had the authority to set the terms. That was new. He sat with it for a long time before he wrote the first word. I had been tracking the Assembly's communications from the Meridian's bridge for 12 days when Admiral Desmond Okafor called me on the secure line and said, "With the economy of someone who does not spend words he does not need to spend, Catherine, I need you aboard the Leviathan." I want to be clear about Desmond Okafor before I describe what happened next. He is a man of measured words and absolute precision. In 7 years of working within the same command structure, I had received exactly 14 direct calls from him. Each one had been short. Each one had contained what it needed to contain, and nothing more. He was not cold. He simply operated on the principle that language was like fuel, something you used deliberately, and did not burn without reason. So I did not ask why. I said I would be there in 3 hours. The Leviathan was 6 days from our position, at a set of coordinates in deep space on the outer edge of the Kepler corridor, a location chosen for its position, relative to the Assembly's nearest border station, and for the fact that it appeared on no Assembly navigation chart, because the charts it would have appeared on were the human-operated open chart navigational feeds that the Assembly no longer had access to. The Leviathan had been there for 9 days, holding at those coordinates, visible if you knew how to look, invisible if you were using the navigation infrastructure you had always relied on. I had known about the Leviathan for 2 years. Okafor had told me on one of those 14 calls, in the tone he used for things that were not discussion items, but operational facts. The ship had been built in classified orbital facilities above Mars over a period of 3 years. Its construction had been funded through a budget line that did not appear in any document that passed through diplomatic channels or Assembly financial reporting, because Earth had stopped sharing financial information with the Assembly's Economic Monitoring Division 14 months before the sanctions vote, on the grounds that the Monitoring Division had been using the information to calibrate the timing of regulatory interventions. The Leviathan had been launched, tested, crewed, and positioned without a single mention in any document that had ever reached Assembly eyes. Captain Dana Prell set a course, and we made the Leviathan in 2 hours and 51 minutes. She was not what I had expected. I had studied the schematics. I had read the capability reports. I thought I understood what 3 years of classified development in Martian orbit would produce. I was wrong about the scale of it in the way that you can be wrong about things you have only encountered as numbers on a screen. When the Meridian came out of the transit approach, and the Leviathan appeared in the viewport, the first thing I felt was not admiration, or excitement, or strategic satisfaction. The first thing I felt was the mild, involuntary stillness that very large things produce in people who encounter them unexpectedly in open space. She was long and dark and completely at rest, not the rest of something waiting, the rest of something that simply was. She sat in the void, with the kind of presence that does not require movement or illumination to communicate. The outer hull was dark alloy, not the polished surface finish that most Assembly military vessels used for ceremonial reasons. She was not built to look impressive from a distance. She was built to function, and the function was written into every line of her. A docking tube brought me aboard. Okafor was in the main corridor, and he shook my hand and walked with me toward the bridge without ceremony. He was tall and broad, and he moved with the economical ease of someone who has spent decades in confined spaces and learned to use them efficiently. "The Assembly sent a flotilla into the outer Kepler approach 2 days ago," he said as we walked. "I tracked it," I said. 40 vessels. They're calling it a goodwill deployment." "It is not a goodwill deployment," he said. "No," I said. The 40 ships were the Assembly's attempt to remind humanity that the conversation was not over. They had not come to fire weapons. That was not the message. The message was the number of ships, and the fact that they had moved at all, because movement in the assembly's language of power meant intent, and intent was meant to produce a reaction. The assembly expected a reaction. The assembly was accustomed to reactions. You moved sufficient force toward a smaller party's territory, and the smaller party's diplomats began making calls. Their lead vessel is the Greth Ascendant, Okafor said. Assembly escort carrier, 600 crew. They have with them 2 Yethri support cruisers, a Mirren signals vessel, and 36 assembly security frigates. What are they carrying? I asked. Standard military complement for security-grade vessels, he said. Nothing that changes any calculation we have already made. He looked at me sideways as we walked, which, as you know, is the point. I understood. They had sent enough to intimidate without sending enough to constitute a genuine threat, because an actual threat required justification, and the sanctions resolution had not provided justification for military action, only for economic and communicative measures. 40 ships was pressure. It was a hand on a shoulder. It said, "We are still here. We are still large. You are still smaller than us. And smaller things in this galaxy have always eventually acknowledged that." We reached the bridge. It was organized. That was the first and strongest impression. Every station was staffed by someone who clearly knew what they were doing, and was doing it. And the activity on the floor had the rhythm of a system running well, rather than the performed busyness you sometimes found on vessels that expected to be inspected. 14 people on duty. Not one of them looked up when I came in. Okafor's first officer, a woman named Carol Bryce, met me with a brief, assessing nod, and handed him a data slate. She was compact and efficient, with red hair cut very short, and the particular quality of focused attention that good officers have, the ability to be fully present in 2 things at once. She said, "Assembly flotilla is still holding at the outer Kepler marker. No change in positioning for the last 8 hours. "How long total?" Okafor asked. 22 hours since they stopped advancing, she said. 22 hours. The flotilla had come to deliver a message, and had stopped when they encountered the Leviathan waiting at the approach, and had been holding position for 22 hours, without advancing, and without retreating, which meant they were doing what military assets do, when they have encountered a situation that requires reporting and deliberation, before the next move can be made. "They've been broadcasting on open assembly channels," Carol said. "Standard request format, asking for communication confirmation, offering to remain outside Kepler space pending dialogue." Okafor looked at me, not asking, giving me the option. "No," I said. He turned to the comms officer, a young man named Paul Greer, and said, "Log the transmissions. File them as unsolicited contact per standing directive." Paul Greer entered it without looking up. I walked to the viewport. The stars beyond the Leviathan's bow were steady, somewhere at the outer edge of the tactical overlay, too far to see directly, but present on every screen in the bridge. 40 assembly ships sat and waited. They had been sitting and waiting for 22 hours. "Show me their sensor readings of us," I said. Carol pulled the relevant data to the secondary main screen. I looked at it. The Leviathan's passive emission profile was clear and detailed, and entirely available to any vessel with standard assembly sensor equipment, because Okafor had activated the full profile 6 hours ago, not to transmit or target anything, simply to be read. The sensor profile told the story of the ship completely. Output ratings, shield capacity ratings, weapons systems manifest, drive specifications. All of it readable by anyone with the right equipment and the patience to look. How long had they been watching us before they stopped advancing? I asked. The advance stopped approximately 4 minutes after our profile became readable at their range, Carol said. 4 minutes. They had needed 4 minutes to look at what we were, and decide not to continue coming toward us. I thought about the Greth Ascendant making its ceremonial pass over Earth's orbital station 8 years ago during the last Assembly Summit. I had watched it from a guest wing window, and found it genuinely impressive. I thought about what the captain of the Greth Ascendant was looking at right now, and what he was finding impressive about it. "There's a personal transmission logged separately," Paul Greer said. He had the careful voice of a comms officer, presenting information that he is uncertain about the reception of. "From the captain of the Greth Ascendant. Personal, not institutional. He transmitted on an open channel, Not an assembly official frequency. Read it, Okafor said. Greer read it aloud. The captain's name was Gregory Hall, and he had been flying assembly vessels for 30 years. The transmission was not formal. It was direct. He said he had looked at the Leviathan's specifications and understood what they meant. He said he was not transmitting on behalf of the Assembly Mission Command or the Flotilla Collective. He said he was transmitting as one vessel captain to whoever was in charge of the ship he was looking at, because he thought that was the clearest available channel. He said he did not think this situation needed to become what it appeared to be becoming, and he asked, plainly, for someone to talk. The bridge was quiet when Greer finished. "Log it and archive it," Okafor said. "Yes, sir." I stood at the viewport for a while longer. Gregory Hall had been flying for 30 years. He had looked at the Leviathan and done the math and reached out on a personal channel because he had correctly assessed that it was the only channel with any chance of producing a human response. He was not wrong about that. He was simply asking at a moment when the answer had already been decided by events that were considerably larger than either of our ships. "Ambassador," Carroll said, "flotilla support vessels are repositioning. Pre-transit configuration." "They're going home," Okafor said. They had come to deliver a message, and had found a message already there, and the message they had found had not left them a response they were prepared to give. So they were going home to report and to wait, and to find out what the next move was supposed to be. I watched the tactical overlay and noted the slow, careful repositioning of 40 ships that had arrived with purpose, and were leaving without having accomplished the thing they came to accomplish. "How many contact requests since the walkout?" I asked Paul Greer. "Total logged, across all frequencies and from all sources?" He checked. 417. 417 calls, messages, formal transmissions, and personal appeals in 12 days. From the Assembly's official channels, from individual member states, from Assembly diplomats, from non-diplomatic species representatives, from the captain of a warship named Gregory Hall, who had looked at what we had built and decided that the correct response was honesty. 417 separate attempts to reach us. None of them had received a reply. "I want to read them," I said. "All of them. Have the archive ready for me after I eat something." "Yes, ma'am," Paul Greer said. Okafor walked to stand beside me. He looked out at the viewport for a moment where the Assembly flotilla was, too far to see but entirely visible on every sensor. "What do you want to do next?" he said, quietly, not pressured, just asking. The answer had not changed. "The same thing," I said. "Nothing." We let the silence work. He considered that. He had the particular quality of stillness that very effective military people have, the ability to be completely present without fidgeting at the edges of a decision they are already committed to. "Gregory Hall is a good man," he said, not an objection. A note. "I know," I said. "He asked the right way." "He did," I said. "And in 2 years, when someone comes to this table who can actually change the terms of what we're doing, I will tell that person that Gregory Hall asked the right way, and I hope they'll carry that forward." Okafor nodded once. He went back to his station. The flotilla continued its slow turn toward home. I went to find something to eat, and then came back and sat with Paul Greer for 4 hours, reading 417 messages from a galaxy that was only beginning to understand what it had done. The messages sorted into categories without my asking Paul to organize them. The largest category was official assembly channels, institutional transmissions from the Assembly's diplomatic office, its economic standards body, its conduct review panel. These were written in the formal language of organizations that have not yet acknowledged that their authority is in question, precise and procedural, and completely unaware of how they sounded from the other side of a closed channel. They said things like, "Pursuant to resolution number, and we formally request, and this constitutes notice, under article," and other phrases that had been doing diplomatic work for 3,000 years, and were now doing it in a room with no one listening. The second category was member state communications. These were different. They were not written in institutional language. They were written by people who had their own economic analysts, and their own supply chain reports, and who had done some version of the calculation that Greth Mail had done for Velkareth, and had arrived at numbers they did not particularly want. The Miran trade representative had sent 3 messages, each one shorter than the last, and the third one dropped the formal structure entirely, and simply said, in plain assembly standard, that the Miron Collective wanted to talk, not through the assembly, but directly, and that they had things they thought were worth discussing. I read that one twice. I filed it in a separate folder that I labeled potential. The third category was the personal transmissions, the ones that had not come through official channels. These were the ones that Paul Greer had flagged with a different marker. There were 27 of them. Scientists who had worked with human researchers and were trying to reach former colleagues. Individuals from species that had never been major assembly players who had written in a tone that suggested they were less invested in the institutional situation than in specific practical concerns. An assembly medical liaison officer who had sent, on the 8th day, a careful and clearly worded note explaining the Yethri plague situation and asking if there was any human point of contact who might be reachable outside the formal channel system. That one I also set aside, and then there was Gregory Hall. I read his message a second time, sitting at Paul Greer's secondary station, while Paul worked quietly at the main board and did not ask what I was doing. Gregory Hall had been flying for 30 years. His message was 11 sentences long, and every sentence had been chosen carefully. He did not claim authority he did not have. He did not pretend to speak for the flotilla command structure, or the assembly. He said clearly that he was speaking as himself, one captain to whoever was in command of the ship he was looking at, because he thought that was worth doing, even if it produced no result. He said, at the end of his message, that he understood if no one answered. He said that was not going to change whether he thought it was worth sending. I sat with that for a while. I thought about what it meant to send a message you already expected would go unanswered, and to send it anyway because the act itself was worth the doing. That was a quality I recognized. It was one of the qualities that had kept human diplomacy functioning in the assembly chamber for 11 years, the understanding that some things are worth doing, regardless of the immediate outcome. The difference was that Gregory Hall had sent his message from a warship that was in the process of turning around and going home, which meant he had sent it without leverage, without position, without anything to offer except the fact of his own direct humanity. I did not answer it. I could not, but I noted his name and his ship name and his message, and I kept them where I could find them. When I finished reading all 417 messages, I sat for a while in the quiet of Paul's section of the bridge and thought about what the collection of them meant. It meant that the galaxy had found 83 different ways to knock on a closed door. Some of those ways were formal, some were casual, some were institutional, and some were personal, and some were from people who were not sure they were doing the right thing, but were doing it because they could not think of anything else. 417 attempts, and the one that had come closest to the quality I would have responded to, if responding had been the right thing, was a personal message from a warship captain who had already accepted that he was not going to get an answer. The flotilla was gone from the tactical display by the time I put the archive away. 40 ships, turned around, heading home. The Kepler corridor was quiet on every sensor. The Leviathan sat in the dark and held its position, and the stars outside were the same stars they had always been. I found Okafor on the port observation deck, which was a long room with wide viewports and no furniture, except a single bench that he was not sitting on. He was standing at the glass with his hands behind his back, looking out at nothing in particular, which was how Okafor looked when he was thinking about something specific. I stood beside him. We were quiet for a while. The stars outside were very clear at this distance from any significant gravity source, sharper than they looked from planetary surfaces, each one distinct. The Miran trade representative sent 3 messages, I said eventually. The third one dropped institutional language. Said they wanted to talk directly. I know, he said. Carol flagged it. It is not an assembly message, I said. It came through a member state channel, not the assembly diplomatic office. He was quiet for a moment. Are you saying we should answer it? I am saying it is different from the others, I said. I am saying it belongs in a different category. He considered that. Not yet, he said. When we are ready to answer something, we answer it on our terms and our timeline. Not because someone found the right tone. He was right. I knew he was right. The discipline of the silence was precisely its completeness. The moment you answered one message, you communicated that the right message might produce an answer, and then the question became what the right message was, and then you were managing a system of incentives rather than communicating a fact. The fact was that we had stopped. The fact was that stopping was not temporary. The fact was not going to become negotiable, because one member state trade representative had figured out how to phrase a request without institutional language. "Not yet," I said. He nodded. We stood at the viewport for a while longer. The Leviathan was very still around us, the way large things are still, with the kind of settled weight that smaller vessels do not have. I thought about the people who had built her, in the shipyards above Mars over 3 years, people who had done that work in the full knowledge that it might never need to be used, and in the equal knowledge that it was right to build it regardless. I thought about what it meant to be the thing in the room that changes all the calculations without saying a word. I thought, not for the first time, that this was exactly what the Assembly had never understood about us. They had watched us negotiate and petition and request, and they had developed a complete theory of what we were based on those observations. They had never thought to ask what we would be when we stopped doing those things. They had assumed the absence of the thing we had always done would simply be a gap, a pause, a space waiting to be filled with the next petition. They had not understood that the absence might be something we had decided on, something we had built toward and prepared for, and were entirely willing to maintain for as long as it took. They had not understood that silence could be a structure. We stood at the viewport until the stars shifted slightly in their apparent positions, which happens over a long enough observation, and which I have always found more grounding than any single clear view. Then I went to find something to sleep in, because the next day there would be more messages to read, and more analysis to review, and more decisions to not make yet, and all of it required being rested and clear. The Leviathan held its position in the dark. The Assembly sent more messages. The stars did not change. The silence continued, full and deliberate, and completely unmoved by anything the galaxy sent across it, working the way silence always works when it is chosen, rather than suffered, which is slowly, and then all at once. My name is Dr. Nina Ashworth. I am a xenobiologist, which means I have spent 16 years studying the behaviors, biology, and social structures of non-human species, a field that the Yethri Collective considers rigorous and important, and that the species being studied would probably describe differently if they were consulted. For 4 of those 16 years I specialized in human behavioral study. In the Yethri academic framework, humans were a category called emerging complex, which meant a species that had developed faster than its diplomatic footprint suggested, and whose trajectory was considered interesting, without being considered urgent. We studied them with the disciplined curiosity you apply to something you find notable but not threatening. I want to say that before I describe what happened to me, because I think it matters. When I left the assembly station on a cargo hauler bound for the outer Kepler corridor, I was not afraid of humans. I was afraid of watching people die on 4 colony worlds from a disease I had the academic background to understand, and the practical ability to do nothing about from inside the assembly's framework. The outbreak numbers had been circulating through the science division for 2 weeks. I had read them. Everyone in my department had read them. We had all read the licensing situation briefing that explained, in the dry, careful language that administrative documents use for information that is not dry at all, that the formula for the only effective Yethri plague vaccine was proprietary, held by a human company that had terminated all assembly contracts before the sanctions vote, and that without the formula, the assembly's own pharmaceutical capacity was inadequate to produce the compound, and that the current supply would last approximately 30 cycles before the 4 active outbreak zones faced a situation for which the administrative language did not have a polite word. My department head had called me into her office and asked if I had any ideas. She meant it as a general request for input, the kind of thing senior staff say when they want people to think creatively about a structural problem. I had one idea that was not a structural solution, and was not creative in any impressive sense. It was just direct. I thought about the closed channels, and the automated messages, and the flotilla that had been reported in the news feeds as turning back without result. I thought about every formal route, and found each one blocked. And then I thought about the fact that I was a private citizen with a xenobiology specialty, who was not listed in any assembly diplomatic registry, and had no assembly title that would appear on a cargo manifest. I could go, just go, book passage, travel to where humans were operating, and ask. I did not tell my department head this idea. I said I would think about it. Then I went home and packed a bag. The cargo hauler was called the Deep Current, and it ran a route through independent space that passed near the Kepler corridor settlements. Its crew was 3 people, of mixed species, including one human pilot named Owen Marsh. He was small and lean and sunburned, in the specific way that people who spend a great deal of time in engine sections get sunburned, which is not from sun, but from some combination of recycled heat and decades of artificial light. He smelled of coolant and metal and did not seem particularly curious about a HFY xenobiologist booking cargo passage on short notice. He said the route would take 14 days. He said the third moon in the Kepler corridor had a settlement with an administration office. I spent the 14 days in a small cabin near the engine section that was exactly as comfortable as a small cabin near the engine section of a cargo hauler can be expected to be. I did not spend the time being uncomfortable about the accommodations. I spent it reading every document I could access about human cultural practices, legal customs, social expectations, economic frameworks, communication norms, preferred forms of address, attitudes toward outsiders, requesting assistance. I had spent 4 years studying humans academically. Over 14 days in a small cabin that smelled of the same coolant as Owen Marsh, I discovered that the distance between academic study and practical preparation is much wider than it appears from the inside of a library. We arrived at the third moon, which was called Archer Point, on the morning of the 14th day. From the viewport it looked modest in size and ambitious in pace. A connected series of habitat structures sat on a gray-green surface, surrounded by active construction, a grid of new buildings going up with the systematic speed of an operation that had very clear targets and sufficient resources to meet them. Owen Marsh told me as he was landing that the initial settlement had been established in 16 months, which I found almost impossible to believe until I counted the active construction cranes from the viewport. The cargo terminal was small and functional, and the 2 humans processing manifests there looked at my documentation with professional attention and no social curiosity whatsoever. Owen pointed me toward the settlement's administration building. I thanked him. He said good luck in the tone of someone for whom good luck is a standard parting phrase with no particular emotional weight. The surface gravity was slightly lower than assembly station standard, and I noticed it in my steps. A minor lifting sensation, pleasant rather than disorienting. The paths between the settlement structures were wide, cleanly surfaced, and well lit. People moved around me in work clothes with the focused, purposeful energy of a community that has a lot to accomplish and is in the process of accomplishing it. A few glanced at me with the mild, noticing look of people who register an unusual thing without interrupting their schedule for it. No one moved toward me. No one spoke. The administration building's residency office was on the ground floor. The woman at the front desk was named Rose Kelly. She was young, maybe 25, with her hair in a practical braid and a data tablet in her hands, and the specific quality of organized efficiency that people develop when they are managing more tasks than most environments would assign to one person. She looked up when I came in. "Hi," she said. "Can I help you?" I told her I was a HFY xenobiologist and that I was seeking asylum from the assembly structure. She did not express surprise. She set down the tablet and pulled a second screen toward her, and said, "Okay, I'll need your species classification, professional documentation, and a brief statement of intent." She looked at me directly. "Do you have identification on you?" I did. I gave it to her. She scanned it and entered the data. The questions she asked after that were organized, practical, and entirely focused on processing information. She did not ask about the diplomatic situation. She did not ask what a HFY scientist was doing in the Kepler corridor. She asked my field of work, whether I had any urgent medical needs, and whether I required temporary housing. 22 minutes after I walked in, she told me my preliminary asylum status had been accepted pending a standard review period, that I had temporary residential authorization for 60 days, and that she would connect me with the settlement's welcome coordinator. I sat in the chair across from her desk and did not say anything for a moment. She waited without impatience, the way someone waits who has learned through practice not to rush people who are processing something. "Thank you," I said. "Of course," she said. No warmth performed, no coldness projected, simply a response to a thing that was true. The welcome coordinator was a man named George Tanner, approximately 50, who moved at the particular pace of someone who respects time enough not to waste it. He showed me to the housing unit I would be using, which was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the construction grid. He explained the settlement's food systems, the communal facility schedule, and the location of the medical clinic, with the same even, informative tone he would presumably use for any new resident, regardless of their species or origin. He did not make me feel like an unusual case. He made me feel like a new resident, which was exactly what I needed. I asked about the clinic because it was the reason I had come. I told him I was a xenobiologist with a background in Yethri epidemiology, and that I had come in connection with the current Yethri plague situation. He looked at me for a moment. The assessment in his expression was not suspicious. It was the look of someone who has just received information that is above their level and is correctly identifying that. "That's a question for Dr. Farida Holt," he said. "She leads our medical research division. I'll connect you." He connected me that afternoon. Dr. Farida Holt was 40 years old, possibly 42, with the kind of direct and complete attention that very good scientists give to things they are thinking about. She met me in the clinic's main research room, which was organized and well-equipped in ways that I had not expected from a 4-year-old settlement on a moon. And she offered me tea. I did not drink the tea because I had not had time to establish whether Yethri biology was compatible with the particular compound. But I held the cup because I had read enough about human hospitality customs to understand that accepting something offered at the start of a meeting was a social signal worth returning. It was a warm cup and I held it, and she sat across from me and waited for me to begin. I told her about the 4 outbreak zones. I gave her the numbers I had memorized on the cargo hauler. I explained the formula situation, the licensing termination, the supply timeline of 30 cycles. I told her that I had not come through any assembly channel because no assembly channel connected to anyone human any longer, and that I was here as a private individual who was a scientist and who had considered the options available and chosen the one that involved actually going somewhere and asking. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you making this request on behalf of the assembly?" "No," I said. "I resigned from my assembly position the morning I left. I am making this request as a Yethri who does not want to watch 4 colony worlds face a preventable medical crisis." She looked at me with the careful attention of someone who is listening to more than the surface of a statement. "The formula for the vaccine is held by 2 researchers," she said, "Dr. Amara Cole and Dr. Ben Whitfield. They developed it under a closed research partnership, which means the formula belongs to them personally, not to the company the licensing was run through. The company closed. The formula did not go anywhere." I said, "Where are they?" "Here," she said. "On this settlement. They built their research lab here 18 months ago. They wanted to work without assembly regulatory oversight, which had been delaying their projects by an average of 6 cycles per review cycle." She paused. "You understand. They have been aware of the outbreak situation." I said I understood. "They have not been waiting for an assembly contact," she said. "They know there are no assembly contacts, but they have been paying attention to the situation." She stood up and picked up her jacket from the back of her chair. "I can take you to meet them, but I want to say something first." I told her to go ahead. "They will help if you ask them the right way," she said. "The right way is not to ask on behalf of an institution. The right way is what you just did with me, which is to tell the truth about the situation, and ask as a person." I thought about Rose Kelly at the residency desk, about George Tanner and the housing unit with the window, about 22 minutes to accept my asylum request and no questions about the politics of it. "I can do that," I said. We went to meet them. Dr. Amara Cole was 38, fast-moving, and talked at a pace that required active attention to follow. Dr. Ben Whitfield was quieter and taller, and during our first 10 minutes of conversation, appeared to be dividing his attention between the discussion and something he was running on his work screen. It took me about 5 minutes to realize that what he was running on his work screen was directly related to the discussion, that he was already computing production numbers while we were still talking through the situation's parameters. He turned his screen toward me without being asked. He had run an initial production estimate, based on the settlement's existing lab capacity, and the population numbers he had pulled from a database I had not yet mentioned. He said they could produce sufficient vaccine for an initial supply run to all 4 outbreak zones in 12 cycles, if they started immediately, and if I could give him accurate population counts for each active zone. I gave him the numbers from memory. He nodded and began entering them. Amara was already on a different screen, moving through something that had the rapid structure of supply chain logistics. "We are not doing this for the assembly," Amara said. She did not look up while she said it. "We are doing it because it is a solvable problem, and people are dying. Those two things together make it a problem we are going to solve." "I know," I said. "The formula stays with us," she said. "We will supply the compound directly. We will not transfer the license or the formula to any assembly institution or affiliate." "I know," I said. She looked up then. She studied my face in the direct, unhurried way of someone who is reading what is behind a statement, rather than just the statement itself. She looked for a few seconds, and then she nodded once, a small and certain movement, and went back to her screen. The room had the specific, comfortable quality of a working space used by people who are genuinely focused on what they are doing. The screens hummed softly. Ben's fingers moved on his interface. Amara was talking quietly into a comms unit about something to do with raw material availability. Outside the window, the settlement's construction grid was still active in the pale late-afternoon light of the moon's long day, cranes moving slowly against a sky that was the particular dusty gray-green of a world that has not yet been touched by enough time. I sent one message to Velkareth that evening from my personal device. I did not offer intelligence or analysis. I wrote 5 sentences. I told him I was at the Kepler corridor. I told him that help was being prepared for the 4 colony worlds. I told him that no assembly institution would receive credit for it, because no assembly institution had made it happen. I told him that the humans had not required me to negotiate, petition, or offer anything in exchange, and I told him that whatever he believed he understood about the current situation, the most important part of it, was not the thing he was looking at. Then I closed the channel. I went to bed in my housing unit with the window looking out over the construction grid, and slept better than I had since before I had read the first outbreak report. In the morning I went back to the clinic and joined Amara and Ben in the first production run. The buildings kept going up outside my window. In 12 cycles, the first vaccine shipment would leave for 4 colony worlds, where people were sick and scared, and had been waiting for a structure to save them, that had spent the past 30 cycles fighting over the question of who owned the formula. The answer to that question had turned out to be 2 scientists on a gray-green moon who considered it a solvable problem and had solved it. I stayed for 6 months. I helped with 3 production runs and contributed to 2 separate research projects that Amara and Ben were running in parallel and did not need my help with, but welcomed it anyway, in the matter-of-fact way that people who are genuinely interested in their work welcome anyone who shares that interest, regardless of where they came from or which institutional framework they had just left. I did not hear back from Velkareth. I thought about that sometimes, in the weeks that followed, as I worked with Amara and Ben and learned the rhythms of the research lab and the settlement around it. I thought about what the silence on his end meant, and I thought about the fact that a person who had spent 22 years in the assembly, who had cast his vote with 846 others, and watched Catherine Elliott walk away, who had sat with Greth Mail's report, and the medical director's numbers, and the automated response playing on loop on his closed channel, might not have an answer to what I had sent him, not because he disagreed with it, but because you do not have an answer for something when the thing it is telling you is that you asked the wrong question for a very long time. The 6th production run shipped in the early morning of my 3rd month on Archer Point. Amara walked me through the manifest. Sufficient vaccine for the population of all 4 outbreak zones, with a reserve quantity for the 2 adjacent colonies that had been showing early indicators. Ben had run the logistics with the same focused efficiency he applied to everything, coordinating with human cargo operations to ensure the shipments moved on a timeline that would reach the most acute zones within 10 days. I stood in the cargo section of the settlement's small transit bay and watched the cases being loaded. They were plain, functional cases, sealed for transit, labeled with destination coordinates and handling specifications. There was no assembly logo on them. There was no human government insignia either. There was just the destination, and the contents, and the routing, the basic information of a shipment going where it was needed. A young cargo handler named Pete Walsh was managing the loadout. He was maybe 22, focused on his work, checking each case against his manifest. He glanced at me once, noted that I was watching, and returned to his checklist without any change in his expression. He was not performing efficiency for my benefit. He was simply doing the work. I thought about my first morning at the assembly station, 11 years before I resigned my position. I had stood in the arrivals hall, surrounded by the architectural grandeur of 3,000 years of galactic governance, and felt the weight of the institution pressing down on everything around it, the particular gravity of a thing that has been powerful for long enough that it begins to feel inevitable. I had thought that the only way to make things better for the people I represented was to learn to move within that gravity, to become skillful enough at its particular rules that I could bend them in the right directions. Pete Walsh checked the last case against his manifest, made a note on his tablet, and signaled the loading team to seal the bay. This was what I had not understood, standing in that arrivals hall. The gravity of an old institution is not the same as the gravity of an important one. The weight of 3,000 years of precedent is not the same as the weight of something actually necessary. The assembly had taught every species that came into contact with it that there was no other table, no other room, no other framework within which the serious work of the galaxy could be done. And enough species had believed that long enough that the belief had become the institution's most important structural element, more important than any treaty or regulation or enforcement mechanism. The cases were loaded, the transit bay sealed. Pete Walsh initialed his manifest and went on to the next task. The vaccine was on its way. I walked back through the settlement toward the research lab. The morning light on Archer Point was a pale, diffuse thing, filtered through an atmosphere still in the early stages of the patient work that would eventually make it breathable without equipment. There was something I liked about that. About building a world in stages, doing the long preparation work without needing it to be finished before you began. Amara was already at her screens when I arrived, running numbers on a secondary project that had nothing to do with the Yethri vaccine and everything to do with what she was actually interested in, which was a class of treatment compounds for a neural condition that affected 3 other assembly member species. She had been working on it for 2 years. She had not filed it with the Assembly Pharmaceutical Review Board. She had not submitted it to any institutional oversight process. She was simply doing the work, carefully and thoroughly, because she had found a problem that was worth solving. I sat down at my own station and pulled up the research file she had shared with me and began where I had left off the day before. The work was slow and detailed, and I was not a specialist in the relevant subdiscipline, but the questions it was asking were the right questions, and asking the right questions was something I understood. Outside the window, the construction cranes continued their patient work against the gray-green sky. We were all, in our various ways, doing the same thing. It was 2 years, 1 month, and 17 days after I walked out of the assembly chamber when the message came through on a private channel, not an official line. Oliver Grant brought it to me in my Geneva office on a morning when the lake outside was the pale, reflective gray of an overcast autumn day, and he set the notification on my desk and stood back in the way that he had learned, over 2 years, to stand back when he was delivering something significant. Supreme Arbiter Marath of the Grethian Continuance, the most senior diplomatic figure in the Galactic Assembly's history, was in Geneva. She had arrived 2 days ago without announcement and had been staying at a small guest house used by neutral diplomatic parties and maintained for exactly this kind of visit. She was requesting a meeting, private channel, not an assembly official transmission, which told me something. The request had come through a personal registry contact, not an institutional one. "How long has the request been open?" I asked. "Since 7 this morning," Oliver said. "It's 10:40. I thought about it for a moment. "Tell her I can meet her Thursday," I said. Oliver calculated. "That's 3 days." "Yes," I said. He sent the reply and went back to his other work, and I sat in my Geneva office for a while thinking about Supreme Arbiter Marath, and about what it meant that she was in this city without announcement, and without the institutional machinery the Assembly normally brought to any formal engagement. I had been watching the Assembly's situation through sources I will not identify. What I knew was this: over 2 years, 12 species that were Assembly members had signed direct bilateral trade and diplomatic agreements with Earth, bypassing the Assembly's framework entirely. 3 more were in informal talks. The Assembly's collective economic output had declined in 7 consecutive quarters, as trade reorganized around human-operated infrastructure. The navigational data that OpenChart had stopped licensing to Assembly vessels had been replaced by a new human-operated mapping network, faster and more current than anything the Assembly had built before, available to any party that contracted with Earth directly. The relay network that had begun degrading in the Assembly's outer approaches 2 years ago had been replaced, in the shipping corridors that mattered to human and human-affiliated traffic, by a new station chain that was not available to Assembly-flagged vessels without separate bilateral arrangement. 8 member species had made those arrangements individually. The Assembly itself still existed. It still met. It still passed resolutions. The resolutions simply carried less weight than they had, because the economic and infrastructural reality of the galaxy no longer organized itself around the Assembly's authority. The Assembly had not collapsed. It had become something closer to a memory of itself, sitting in the same beautiful station, speaking in the same languages, conducting the same procedures, but conducting them in a galaxy that was increasingly building its own arrangements around it. Mareth had come to Geneva because the Assembly had run out of formal mechanisms. The official channels were closed. The bilateral agreements were happening whether the Assembly approved or not. The medical situation with the Yethri plague had been resolved without Assembly involvement, a fact that had produced a particular kind of internal anger inside the Assembly Council that had nowhere useful to go. The 12 bilateral signatories were not going to leave the Assembly, because leaving carried social costs that being broadly inactive did not. But they were also not going to stop trading directly with Earth, because trading directly with Earth was generating better outcomes than routing through Assembly frameworks. Mareth had come because someone had to, and she was the only person in the Assembly whose status was high enough that her presence here would be understood as the statement it was meant to be. I met her on Thursday morning. Oliver showed her in at 10. She was taller than I had expected, Grethian tall, which is taller than the average for most Assembly species, and she moved with the controlled posture of someone who has stood very straight for 40 years, and intends to keep doing it. Her robes were simple, relative to Assembly formal standards, a single deep color, without the ceremonial layering that Assembly events normally required, which told me that she had chosen to signal something in how she dressed for this. She had not brought an aide. She had not brought a translator, which told me her Assembly standard was either excellent or that she had prepared very thoroughly for a meeting conducted without one. I offered her a chair. She took it. I offered coffee. She looked at it with the expression of someone who has done significant research on a topic and is encountering the physical reality of it for the first time. She said, in clean and precise Assembly standard, that she knew what it was. She set the cup on the table without touching it. I watched recordings of your morning briefings from the Assembly station, she said. You always had a cup. That was an interesting way to begin. She was telling me the level of preparation she had done without making it a threat. She was establishing that she had come ready. What would you like to discuss? I said. She folded her hands in her lap with the deliberate quality of a gesture that has been considered rather than habitual. I believe you know what I am here for, she said. I do, I said, but I would like to hear it from you. A pause, not hesitation, consideration. The Assembly is interested in discussing terms for a renewed framework of engagement with Earth and its affiliated territories, she said. It was the cleanest, most exactly balanced version of what she needed to say. No admission of need, no concession of position, a statement of interest. I slid the document across the table. I had prepared it 6 months ago. I had known something like this meeting was coming, not when and not where, but the direction of it had been visible long enough to prepare for. I had not wanted to negotiate in the moment. I had wanted the terms written before we were in the same room, so that what happened in this room was not a negotiation but a reading. Mareth picked up the document and read it. She was methodical and thorough, page by page, her face still. I watched her eyes move. 40 years of Assembly diplomatic experience meant she was reading at 2 levels simultaneously, the surface text and the implication structure underneath it. She did not rush. The document said, Earth's formal right of veto on all Assembly resolutions affecting human or human-affiliated territories. Complete sovereignty over all existing and future human colonial settlements without Assembly licensing requirements. Open bilateral access rights for any species seeking direct trade or diplomatic engagement with Earth, independent of Assembly membership status. Full human-operated navigational and communications infrastructure made available to Assembly member states on individual bilateral terms. And a final clause, which I considered the most essential, the Assembly's formal acknowledgement in its public record that the sanctions resolution of 2 years ago had been applied without adequate review of human contributions to galactic infrastructure, and that the Assembly recognized this as an error. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. I had chosen that word with a care that I imagined she recognized when she reached that page. She read to the end. She set the document down with the careful precision of someone who is managing the movement of their hands very consciously. She looked at me. "You planned this from the beginning," she said. I picked up my coffee. It had cooled to the temperature I prefer for drinking, which is slightly below what most people would consider ideal. Outside the window, the lake was the pale silver gray of a November morning. "No," I said. "You planned it. You and 847 colleagues, over the course of 11 years of votes and resolutions, and decisions made about us in rooms we were occasionally invited into. Every time you decided we needed your permission for something we had already built. Every time you passed a resolution because you could, without asking what we would do when we understood that you would keep doing it. You created every condition you are sitting in right now. We simply stopped pretending those conditions were negotiable." She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the document, not reading it again, looking at it the way you look at something when you are thinking about what it means. "If the Assembly accepts this," she said, "the Assembly, as it has existed for 3,000 years, ceases to exist in its current form. The Assembly as it has existed for the past 2 years also no longer exists in its current form," I said. "The question is not whether things change. The question is whether the change happens with this document or without it." She looked at me. "You could have made this easier," she said. I considered that. I thought about 11 years of careful words and open doors, and extended patience. About the 9 occasions on which I had found polite language to express humanity's disappointment in Assembly votes that had not gone our way. About the formal petitions and the impact assessments and the requests for hearing, and the hours and hours of process that the Assembly had extended, not as a genuine path toward resolution, but as a management tool for a species it considered a minor ongoing concern. "We tried easy," I said. "For 11 years we tried easy. Easy meant we kept trying, and you kept voting. This is what comes after easy." She looked at the table for a moment. Then she reached forward and picked up the pen I had set beside the document. A physical pen, writing on paper. I had done that on purpose. I wanted ink. I wanted something that could not be quietly revised, or technically ambiguous. I wanted the weight of it. She signed each page. Her signature was small and careful, and she took her time with each one, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood what she was signing, and was not going to pretend otherwise. When she finished the last page, she set the pen down and sat with the signed document in front of her for a moment. Then she stood. I stood. "The Assembly will require time for formal ratification," she said. "We know," I said. "We are not in a hurry." She looked at me for a long moment before she said what she said next, and in that moment, I saw something that I had not expected, and that I found more affecting than anything else in the entire conversation. She was not angry. She was not humiliated in the way that public defeat produces humiliation. She was something more complicated. She was a person who has been very good at her work for a very long time, looking at evidence that the world her work was designed for has become something different, and sitting with what that means about the work and the world in equal measure. She was grieving something, and she was also, in the same moment, recognizing something, and those two things were happening at the same time, without contradiction. I did not try to address it. There was nothing to say. Some recognitions are simply true, and the only thing you can do with them is let them be. She said, quietly, and without performance, "You were never going to come back." "No," I said, "we were not." She nodded once. She picked up her coat. She walked to the door where Oliver was waiting. At the doorway she stopped and did not turn fully back but spoke into the space between us, in a voice that was low and precise, and not directed at me so much as at the air itself. "You were not what we thought you were," she said. "No," I said, "we were not." She left. I stood in the office for a while. Oliver came back in, and looked at the signed document on the desk without touching it. He had been with me from the first morning in the Assembly chamber to this Geneva morning, 2 years and 17 days of silence and building and watching and waiting, and he had not needed to ask anything. He stood there and I stood there, and the document sat between us on the desk, Ink dry, real, done. I walked to the window. The lake was going silver to pale blue as the cloud cover shifted. A small boat moved slowly across it, far out, almost at the opposite shore. 2 years ago I had watched stars hold still through a different viewport, on a different ship, and thought about what the silence would cost, and whether it would build anything worth what it cost. I thought now about Nina Ashworth in a small housing unit on a gray-green moon, sleeping well for the first time in weeks, after 2 scientists handed her a production schedule with no conditions attached. I thought about Gregory Hall transmitting on an open personal channel from a ship he had not been asked to move. I thought about Rose Kelly at the residency desk, saying of course, in a voice that was simply a response to something that was true. I thought about Owen Marsh, who had smelled of coolant and had said good luck, in a tone that made it just a way of saying goodbye. We had not done what we did out of anger, though there was anger in it, nor out of revenge, though there was justice in it, nor out of strategy, though there was strategy in it. We had done it because the doors in front of us had been closed for long enough that we had stopped standing at them, and when you stop standing at closed doors and turn around, the first thing you see is all the space behind you, where you might have been building all along. Oliver picked up the document and went to file it, carefully, in the right place. I finished my coffee. The boat on the lake reached the far shore. The clouds continued shifting, and the light kept changing in the way that November light does over water. Gray and silver, and occasionally, briefly, something close to gold. Somewhere in the Galactic Assembly's home station, on its long-range relay network that ran now on a mix of their own rebuilt infrastructure and human-operated stations licensed under the new terms, the first signals of the ratification process would begin moving. Member states would be contacted. Committees would be convened. The Assembly would do what institutions do when the reality around them has been formally acknowledged, which is find the most procedurally correct path through the change, and call it a process. That was fine. Let it take the time it took. We had things to build. Oliver was back at his desk before I turned from the window. He was already on the next thing, the way he always was. I went and sat at my desk and looked at the work that was waiting, which was a great deal of it, the kind of work that fills your days when you are no longer spending most of your energy explaining yourself to people who had decided before you opened your mouth what they were going to hear. Outside, without announcement, without proclamation, without any formal statement from any body or institution, the Galactic Assembly's 3,000-year-old order became something new. It did not become what it had been. It became something that had room in it for what we were. And we went back to work. I want to say something about what the 2 years had looked like from the inside of it, because from the outside, in the news feeds and the diplomatic analyses and the commentary that the Assembly's own information services produced during that period, it looked like a standoff. 2 parties in opposition, one party applying pressure, the other resisting, both waiting for the other to break. That was the framework that existing language provided for it. And it was not entirely wrong, but it was not right in the ways that mattered. From the inside, from where I sat on the Meridian, and then in Geneva, the 2 years looked like building. Every day was work that had nothing to do with the Assembly, and everything to do with what we were making. The bilateral agreements were not trophies. They were the framework of something real, of a galactic economy organized around actual function rather than institutional inheritance, in which species traded and collaborated and resolved disputes based on the merits of the situation, rather than on who had the most votes in a chamber that was 3,000 years old, and had been governing by inertia for most of them. The Assembly had imagined, I think, that we were suffering in the silence, that the absence of Assembly access was producing the kind of pain that would eventually produce capitulation. I think Velkareth spent the first several months of the 2 years checking the automated rejection system to see if it had stopped receiving requests, as though the cessation of contact would indicate the end of humanity's ability to sustain the position. The requests kept coming. The system kept logging them. The answer never changed. What we were doing while the Assembly waited for us to break was exactly what we had always done, which was the work. The relay stations were running. The pharmaceutical research was advancing. The 6 colonies in the Kepler corridor had grown to 9, and the 9 were beginning to develop the particular gravity that established settlements develop, drawing in people and resources and ideas by the simple fact of existing and being functional. The bilateral signatories were trading directly with us at volumes that exceeded what they had traded through assembly-mediated frameworks, because trading without the assembly's licensing and regulatory layers turned out to be more efficient in almost every measurable way. The Miran Collective, which had been one of the early bilateral signatories, reported in its third-quarter economic summary that direct human trade agreements had produced the strongest growth figure in its recent history. They had not shared that summary with the Assembly. They had shared it with us. Oliver came back from filing the signed document and sat at his desk and pulled up the next thing on his list, which was a briefing on the status of the 9th Kepler settlement's water processing infrastructure. I watched him for a moment. He had changed over the 2 years, in the way that people change when they spend a long time doing something they have fully committed to. He was less careful in the tentative sense, and more careful in the thorough sense. He spent less energy on managing how things looked and more on managing how they worked. I thought about him on the night we left the assembly station, holding my bag in the corridor with the particular stillness of someone who had prepared for outcomes and arrived at none of them. He had stepped into the unknown that night with me, without asking whether we were sure about what we were doing, because he had been sure, because he had looked at the same evidence I had looked at, and reached the same conclusion by a slightly different route. That was what we were, in the end. Not a government's diplomatic calculation, not a political strategy, not even an act of collective defiance, though it had elements of all of those. We were a large number of people who had looked at the situation clearly and agreed on what it meant and done the thing that agreement required, and then done it again the next day, and the day after that, quietly and without ceremony, for 2 years. Meredith had said you were not what we thought you were. I had agreed with her, but sitting in my office on the afternoon after she left, with the lake going gold in the late autumn light, and Oliver working at his desk on Kepler water infrastructure, I thought about what the Assembly had thought we were. They had thought we were a species that needed management. Not because we were small or because we were dangerous, but because we were new, and the Assembly's 3,000-year-old institutional reflex for new species was to establish their position in the hierarchy before they established their own, to make clear, early and repeatedly, that the framework existed and that they would be operating within it. They had done that to us for 11 years. What they had not understood, and what Meredith was beginning to understand when she looked at the signed document on the table, was that applying that reflex to a species that had the particular human quality of deciding, once committed to a direction, to commit completely, was not management. It was motivation. Every sanction, every vote, every moment in 11 years when the Assembly demonstrated that there was no outcome available to us except compliance, had been building toward the morning I placed the translator on the podium and turned my back on the room. We had not planned the walkout as a strategy. We had arrived at it as a conclusion. The conclusion was simply this. The Assembly had made it clear that it would never offer us a different relationship than the one it had decided we deserved. So we had built a different relationship ourselves, with any party that was interested, on terms we had set, without asking for authorization from a body whose authority over us we no longer recognized. It had worked, because we were right about what we were, not what we would become, not our future potential, not our projected growth trajectory. What we already were, when the Assembly voted, and had been for some time, building quietly in the spaces between the resolutions. We had simply stopped pretending otherwise. Oliver looked up from his screen. The water processing review is scheduled for Thursday, he said. Same day as the first formal ratification briefing from the Assembly's committee chair. Do you want them adjacent or separated? Separated, I said. Keep the settlement work in the morning. Assembly matters in the afternoon. Done, he said, and went back to his screen. I pulled up my own work. There was a great deal of it. The bilateral framework required attention. The new colony infrastructure required review. The research coordination with Amara and Ben's team required a response that I had been meaning to send for 3 days. There were messages from the Miran trade representative, who had become someone I now spoke to directly and regularly, and from a Yethri scientific liaison who was developing a joint research proposal with a human university, and from Gregory Hall, who had been reassigned from the Greth Ascendant to an assembly liaison post, and who had sent, 6 weeks ago, a brief note saying that he thought what had happened over the past 2 years was worth studying carefully, and that he hoped to have the opportunity to discuss it. I had written back to Gregory Hall. That was the first assembly-adjacent message I had answered. Not on behalf of any institution but personally, as one person to another who had said something honest from a ship that was turning around. I had said that I thought the opportunity would come, and that when it did, I would be glad of the conversation. Some doors, it turned out, were worth opening again once the terms of who was allowed to open them had been properly understood. I went back to work. The lake outside the window caught the last of the afternoon light and held it for a while, gold on the water, patient and unhurried, the way light is when the day has been long and the work has been good and the thing you set out to do has been, on balance, done.